Andrew is a Victorian Aboriginal man who's had more than 30 years' experience in Aboriginal affairs policy and administration. He's now, from 2013, he was appointed Victoria's first Commissioner for Aboriginal Children and Young People. Australia's first as well?
Yes.
Australia's and Victoria's first. His office is independent of government, and he's a champion of vulnerable Koori young people, working aside Bernie Geary, the Principal Commissioner for Children and Young People. He came to the post with a long family history of activism on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders' rights and a deep understanding of justice issues as the former director of the Koori Justice Unit, which coordinates the Victorian Aboriginal Justice Agreement. Under the Taskforce 1000 project, he's currently reviewing 1,000 individual cases of Aboriginal children in out-of-home care to examine the systemic failings that have produced steep increases in the number of children removed, not just from parents, but from culture and community. I'd like to welcome him to speak to us. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. And as is our custom, I do also acknowledge the traditional owners, custodians of the land we're meeting on here tonight, gathering on, the Jackomos and their elders, both past and present. I also acknowledge all the good people, all you good people in the room, because if you were not of good of heart, I suspect you would not be here on Saturday evening. That's unless you're here to heckle either Antoinette or me or both of us. I particularly like to acknowledge Raylene Harradine, the CEO of Bendigo and District Aboriginal Corporation, who's been a very good long friend of mine. The traditional owners here have nurtured their lands and waters, their culture and families for literally thousands of years. But a community that over the past 200 years has had their land stolen, family and clans rounded up as cattle and herded onto missions and government reserves, as has happened across the nation. A community that was for generations disconnected from their traditional practices, languages and social structures, governance arrangements and self-determination. As a community that had their children and babies forcibly removed, that commenced intergenerational removal and trauma, that has had a continuing impact to this very day. A community that, to this very day, has had their children removed and entering into justice supervision in record numbers, and a community whose children are impacted upon at record levels of family violence. Just a little bit more to what Martin said, I'm a Yorta Gunditjmara man, always was and always will be. I'm not a descendant of the Gunditjmara and Yorta, I am Gunditjmara and Yorta. On my father's side, the heritage is also from the Greek island of Gustalorizal, and I'm still suffering travel lag. I've just arrived back from being to the island, the first time ever, and my grandparents left the island 100 years ago as refugees from Turkish occupation. And when I was there, sadly, you catch a ferry there, no plane, and the island is like an orange glow. And the glow is of life jackets that ring the island from refugees. And it's just an interesting juxtaposition where the refugees are fleeing to the island that my grandparents fled from 100 years ago. And sadly, not all of them reached the island. It is too easy to paint the picture that is all doom and gloom, and it isn't, because to say would be to undermine those families and individuals in our community here in Victoria and elsewhere in the nation who've been successful in escape and generational poverty and despair. People who have grown strong families against adversity. Let me say emphatically that last year we saw the number of Victorian Koori students statewide that graduated from Year 12 at record numbers, and that's grown each year. And with this record numbers of Kooris, I continue on to tertiary education across all disciplines and clans. Our young people are standing up. The Victorian Youth Council convened their annual summit in April with over 150 of our young leaders and role models from across the state participating. Beautiful young people, strong of culture. In feedback to Minister Jenny Jackomos, in her role as Minister for Youth Affairs, and other key stakeholders, young people shared their ideas about health, well-being, cultural strength, and having a voice in the areas that impact upon them. I am encouraged, strongly encouraged, by our own community sector, such as that works here in Bendigo, and the Andrews government's commitment to improving outcomes, not just for Koori children, but for all our community. I'm particularly encouraged by the state government's discussions with the Victorian Koori community about the development of a treaty and what it would look like. Victoria is the only jurisdiction in the nation to walk the road with our community. There are positive signs for the future, but we all acknowledge we have a long way to go. But just to make it clear, it was our community that brought the government along to the table to talk about a treaty, not the other way around. The most important thing we can desire for our children is to have a future in which they are healthy and safe, free from racism, injustice, persecution and prosecution. A society that values them as individuals and community and their place in it, ensures they have a good education, enabling them to be economically free, secure and independent, and one where they have the opportunity to develop the skills and are given the opportunity to be able to work in a field of their choice. I want our children to know their identity, to be proud of their identity, and for the broader community to celebrate along with them their cultural identity and that of the community in which they live. Surely this is the dream, the desire all parents will have or should have for their children, be they Koori or non-Koori. Education is fundamental to creating the shift for our community, a shift to being free from welfare dependency and ensure every child is healthy and living in a nurturing home environment, free from violence and enveloped in love and respect. The challenge for our community, the whole community and nation, is to work with our community to move as a whole to that environment. I do want to tell you that the majority of Koori children in Victoria are nurtured, educated and loved in culturally rich and loving families, the great majority. The great majority of our children here in Bendigo are raised in loving and culturally rich homes, and that's a fact. But sadly, it is not the case for all of our children. Nationwide, for Koori children in Victoria, and it's not the case for all our children in Bendigo. And in fact, they are overrepresented to being vulnerable. I'm sad to say, sometimes, many times, on a daily basis in my role as Commissioner for Aboriginal Children and Young People, I see the devastating impacts of intergenerational trauma and the impact from the response by the service system that's meant to protect our children. I find it difficult to understand how the Andrews government will not, and is not to this moment, vigorously challenging other jurisdictions, including the Commonwealth, to support close the gap targets for youth justice or children's removal when they already exist in the Victorian Aboriginal Affairs Framework. In Victoria, Koori children are 12 times more likely to be in detention, and our children make up 15% of all justice supervision. We may be doing better than the national average in Victoria, But given we are just 1% of the population, it remains staggering for me that our children are so overrepresented in the youth justice, in detention, in the society that claims to be first world. A quarter of a century ago, the National Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody found that a contributing factor to the significant overrepresentation of our people in the justice system, and dare I say the high numbers of child removals today, is directly related to the impact of past government policies and social practices of land theft, child removals, and our people being placed on missions and discouraged from using language and practicing culture. And we know that if you have a child protection history in this state, you're more likely to have poor education, poor health outcomes, poor employment outcomes, and have greater exposure to the justice system. I know that culture, which embodies knowing one's identity, being able to live your culture and being connected to community, is the most powerful and resilient factor, along with education in protecting and nurturing our children. I see the symptoms, the outcomes of past and failed government policies and national attitudes, the intergenerational trauma, grief and loss, the exceedingly high rates of Aboriginal children subject to child protection orders. 20% of all children in Victoria are Koori in out-of-home care, yet only 1% of the population. The gross overrepresentation of our children detained in youth centres. The fastest growth rate is the increasing overrepresentation of our young women in the prison system. Women in many circumstances who were babes in arms removed from family and who continue to be victims of family violence and sexual abuse. Every day in my job, I see the foundations, individual children being laid for future admission to the prison system. Some of you may be aware of my work in Taskforce 1000 over the past 2 years, where we have critically reviewed close to 1,000 Koori children in the care of the state here in Victoria. Sadly, that is now grown to 1,500 just in 2 years and is increasingly to grow. In fact, the number and ratio of Aboriginal children in Victoria and out-of-home care today is greater than it ever has been. Our task force revealed that male perpetrated family violence is the leading reason our children have been removed from home. In most cases, violence is coupled with alcohol and drug misuse and mental health issues. Can I say at this point that it is not just Koori men who are offenders. It is all men from all community groups that are offending against the mothers of Aboriginal children and children. Other common themes include parental child removal and incarceration, poor housing and transience, particularly of mum, clear lack of education achievements and work history. So for every child I look at, I see virtually every case where at least one of the parents have had a history of child protection and one of the parents at least have been incarcerated. We know that children who become isolated from culture and community networks when placed in out-of-home care become more vulnerable to abuse and less able to seek help. They are disconnected, they are boats without anchors, and they are drifting. And our prison system is full of people who are drifters. We also know that many Koori children in out-of-home care are progressing to the youth justice system at alarming rates, further disconnecting them from cultural ties and identity. Yes, there is a direct linkage between parental family violence, child protection, youth justice, and homelessness. It's a vicious cycle. I had a young 13-year-old boy in Parkville show me the cell in which his mother gave birth to him as a child, mum as a child. Many are in a vortex where the government has assumed their role as parent and guardian, but at the same time they're jailer, an architect of both of these systems. The age of criminal responsibility in Victoria and nationally is just 10 years of age. This is a very young age for our legal system. For me, it's immoral. and our society transitions children from victims to criminals. It is some 4 years lower than the international average. Our children are younger when they're locked up, and they return to detention more quickly. All this means that our children, Koori kids, are more likely to be incarcerated as an adult, and their children more likely to be incarcerated. This is unacceptable for our community, and it must be unacceptable for the broader Australian community. The common backdrop against which this scene is set is the experience of intergenerational trauma, grief and loss. Learnings from the past are not changing the trajectory for our children. Generational cycles of poverty, disadvantage, disconnection and discrimination are not being broken. The past continues to claw into our future. I was in a town not far from here, and as part of my work and reviewing, I looked at 83 children in out-of-home care, and 64 of those children were on the same family tree. And as I looked, I can see, and I was related to 85% of those children. And on the family tree, I can see generation after generation. We must work out a way to halt these cycles and reshape the future. Of course, we know that the survival of our culture does not depend on recognition by the dominant structures, but it is helpful. I see cultural revitalisation all around me, as they've done for over 50,000 years. Our people will continue to rise up against adversity. Our cultures continue to grow, evolve and adapt. And when I look at the Koori Youth Summit and our youth there, I am certain in my words. A young mother rang me a couple of days ago, who I know and who I'm related to, and asked me if I could help her daughter enter the police academy. And this young girl is from a family that has had generational connection with the criminal justice system. And for this young mum to say to me that her daughter wants to join the police was quite an interesting. In Victoria, cultural rights are now enshrined in law in our Charter of Human Rights and Responsibilities. And despite its initial resistance, Australia gave formal statement of support. Yep. United Nations. There is now a legislative mandate in Victoria to implement cultural support plans for all our children in our home care. And as I say, it's so critical and so intergenerational, the loss, but in critical culture. For me, access to good, relevant and appropriate education is fundamental to key. So is that 30 seconds or 60?
5 minutes.
5 minutes, oh, okay. I can do that. To see the shift in outcomes for our community. Children in child protection achieve poor education outcomes than other children. A lot of that's due to constant movement from site to site, but it's also due to the education system. I know. I have people in the education system tell me, I don't want to see our Koori children pushed into flexible learning models where they can attend school for a couple of hours a week. I want to see our children that they are strong in literacy, maths, science and arts. I do not want to hear of country towns here in Victoria about children being kept away during NAPLAN tests or being pushed over to VCAL or being suspended or expelled for behaviours resulting from their abuse and neglect. Our children in our home care are in the care of the state, but I constantly hear of our children being pushed out from their right to access and full access of education because the school system principals, some principals in key locations, are pushing our kids out to flexible learning models so they don't impact on NAPLAN scores. I want to see more community-led initiatives towards justice reinvestment, such as in New South Wales. Together, ways to reduce offending and make the community safer have been developed. Data has been collected and used to implement programs for better outcomes. We must seize opportunity through Royal Commission into family violence and roadmap to reform of the child protection system, where conversations about self-determination, prevention and early intervention are flourishing. I think I'll leave it there. Yeah. So thank you very much for your time.